Okay, this is the State Repression Lecture, Part 3. We left off last time talking about the deficiency model to explain when states get abusive with their people. Now let's talk about the rational choice model. According to this model, the states use repression if they conclude that the benefits exceed the costs. So this is an economic model, and by the way, rational choice theory gets used a lot in criminal justice and many other different areas of the social sciences trying to explain human behavior. It's a very popular theory in many fields, and it's a very simple idea that human beings like to maximize benefits and minimize costs. They like to get the most out of whatever they can get out of things with the least cost possible. So the idea is that government officials will look at a situation and they'll say, okay, what are the costs and benefits of using state repression, of mass, locking everybody up over and over, even though they haven't violated any laws, or whatever sort of technique that we're going to use, killing people, depriving people of jobs and other money and other sorts of things, that they'll look at the situation and see whether that makes sense, if it's going to pay or not, if it's going to work, and how costly is it going to be, and is there some way that's going to be more effective, less costly, and do a better job of solving the problem. So this theory just looks at government officials as not really having principles or beliefs that they're following, other than the belief of, hey, let's do what's going to have the biggest payoff. Again, think of it like an economist would, somebody who thinks of things kind of in terms of money, of pluses and minuses, costs and benefits. It is thought that states turn to repression if they lack resources to use less coercive means. So here it sounds kind of like the deficiency model, that there's some overlap here, that if you lack resources, that you might have to use a little higher risk, less desirable strategy of using state repression, of abusing people's rights. So it's costly, it's costly to do state repressive sorts of activities, because naturally people don't like it. People are going to resist and resent you if you are abusing them and violating their rights. There's going to be some reaction against that, some maybe retaliation or some defiance, or people, if you're unjust to people, they tend to want to fight back. So that's a costly, high risk way to be really punitive and nasty with a population. And so a lot of times it really doesn't make sense for a government, from this economic type of model, rational choice model, it doesn't really make sense to use state repression, because it tends to be a high risk, costly thing to do that often backfires and doesn't always work very well. So a lot of times governments try to find nicer ways of handling threats from the community, from citizens, trying to reduce anger and resentment and stuff, and that sort of thing from citizens, because if you can use more humane techniques, then you don't get the backfire, you don't get the resistance, you don't get you don't turn your citizens into enemies who want to fight back and maybe even get rid of you, right? So anyway, again, this is just the main thing you want to get from this, is how you would approach this issue, understanding state repression from a rational choice model. That's the main thing I'm wanting you to get in for this course, is just how, if you use a theory like this, how would it make you think about an issue? Here are some core research findings from this tradition of research that takes a rational choice approach. That states use repression when they perceive that the threats to the status quo, when they perceive threats, and to eliminate the threat. So that's the same thing as what we saw before, that it's, maybe somebody might think that, well, when this government gets nasty, towards citizens that it's acting irrationally, that maybe these are that these government officials who make these decisions, they're not thinking straight, they're not thinking coolly, it's an emotional sort of thing. But what rational choice theory says is that no, that leaders are very calculated, and that they think things through, they look at the costs and benefits, weigh the pros and the cons, and it's a very everything's calculated kind of move. And so that when they're lashing out at citizens and trying, and doing all of these abuses, violations of their rights, it's done for it's done for a specific purpose, which is to control, right? To eliminate the threat. It looks like the government's being threatened right now. The people seem to be rising up against it. We can't have that. And so how are we going to eliminate this threat? How are we going to, neutralize it and get people back to being peaceful? And that if they calculate and they decide that repression is going to be the least costly, most effective way, then they do it. So this approach sees people's behavior as being calculated, cold, cool, and with a purpose, right? So this is called the law of coercive responsiveness. Why do these governments do this? Because they're seeing a threat and they're trying to preserve order, preserve the status quo, meaning that they want to stay in power. The government wants to stay in power, and the officials within that government want to stay in power. And that on the back of people's minds always is this idea of revolution. What if people want to overthrow us? We're going to lose our jobs. We could lose our heads, our lives, and so we want to keep things the same because we like the government that we have in the positions that we enjoy there, right? So that's this law of coercive responsiveness, that state repression is used when it's perceived that there's a threat that needs to be controlled. Another core research finding is that repression controls behavior inconsistently. It variously reduces, increases, or does not affect threats. And this, I think, is really common sense. That if you get nasty with people, they may give up. They may surrender and stop their threatening behavior, and you win. But on the other hand, when you're nasty with people, they sometimes will get nasty back. That's human nature, is to reciprocate. And so sometimes when you think you're going to use this punishment, this nastiness, to deter people, to convince them to stop their threatening behavior, what people will do is they'll double down and they'll get more defiant. And they'll say, well, if you're really the enemy now, we were upset before, now we're really upset because of all of these human rights violations. And so we're going to come at you twice as hard. So you get defiance. And so that can increase the threatening behavior as opposed to making it go away. So again, it's a risky strategy for these government officials to use these inhumane, human rights abusing tactics, because so often it doesn't work. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Repression is more likely to happen if the threat aims to replace rather than reform the regime. So again, if you have people who are just, say, for example, protesting for reforms, they want to see new policies, new laws, and they're peaceful and they seem to be constructive and positive, maybe passionate, but they're working within the system and they're working peacefully, then the government is more likely to say, okay, let's try to work with these people and come up with some answer. And then we don't have to go there and use this state repression because it looks like we can deal with these people in a more constructive, positive way. They seem like there's some threatening stuff going on there, but it seems like a low enough level threat that we can work with these people. But on the other hand, if the threats seem to indicate, wow, that these organizations, these groups of people are rising up and they want to engage in revolution, revolt, and they want to come after us and kick us out of our offices and maybe kill us and take over. Well, that's really threatening. And if in that case, then let's use it makes sense to get nasty and to engage in human rights violations and really violence and all that kind of thing against the people, because it's either us or them kind of a thing. It's survival. It's wow, looks like a desperate situation, and desperate situation calls for desperate measures, that kind of a thing. So, and that's consistent with the research that if you're revolutionaries, the state's probably going to come at you a lot more coercively and violently than if you're peaceful protesters just looking in a peaceful way for reform, for positive change, right? It should be noted that the state has various non-coercive avenues to respond to: persuasion and positive incentives. So again, if you're providing jobs for people, that's a positive. It still might be a way to cause them to not be threats. Like you may do it, your motivation may be, these people are scaring me, so how are we going to deal with this? Well, let's give them jobs, and so they won't be angry anymore. See, so it's a positive thing, even though it's still, you're worried about self-preservation and you're worried about protecting the government and the state. It still is handling it in a more positive sort of way. So persuasion is another one, where you try to communicate and persuade folks that their anger is really misplaced, or that their anger is not justified, that if you can get people to think differently about the issues in the situation through persuasion, okay, that's again a more positive, nonviolent, peaceful tactic to try to reduce some threat that the government perceives. So, of course, there's lots of different options that you can use to try to influence the population, influence the citizens. Some of them much harsher, and some of them more positive. There's a whole range of things. And again, what the rational choice people are trying to do is figure out which one of those techniques, nicer, more positive ones, or nastier ones, which one of those techniques is going to work the best, be most effective, is going to be the least expensive, and give us the most bang for the buck kind of a thing. That's what rational choice theory is focusing on. Again, the costs and the benefits. Repression is least likely to be used by, this is an interesting finding, by highly autocratic and highly democratic states. So if you have a very mature democratic government, say some Western European government that's very, that's really quite in touch with what the people want and tries really hard to solve threats or unhappiness from the population by positive things, you're not going to get too much state repression in these kind of highly developed democratic states, governments in certain parts of the world. So you don't get too much state repression in those kind of governments, but you also don't get as very much state repression in really these dictatorship sorts of really highly autocratic governments. So kind of the worst end of when it comes to democracy and freedom versus being controlled by the government. In highly controlling states, governments, highly autocratic ones, you don't get too much state repression because the citizens are also terrified of rising up against the state because the state's so powerful and could be repressive that people don't even try. They're more likely to obey, be peaceful, and not pose a threat. And so the government doesn't really have to do too much to lash out and control you because everybody's terrified and they behave anyway, right? So you kind of, it's a counterintuitive or ironic thing that in these really top-down societies, you don't necessarily see as many of these abuses that we're talking about, mass killings of people and mass incarcerations of people who haven't done anything wrong, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because people are compliant and they follow along and do what they're told. And so it's on one level it's kind of coercive because everybody's afraid, but you don't see these obvious types of state repression that we're focusing on here. So pursuing both counterinsurgency and democratization at the same time tends to undermine both. So this is not a very clear way of putting this, but what you're saying is the societies in the middle that are trying to move away from being dictatorships, top-down controlled by a small number of people at the top, as you're trying to become democratic and give people the vote and move in that direction, as you're transitioning, you tend to get a lot of state repression because people are starting to get a taste of freedom, a taste of a little bit of power and say and input in their society. And so it's in this immature situation, you tend to get a lot of state repression. You get nastiness in the transition time. So that's one thing you often see. It's an important sociological finding that when societies engage in dramatic change from one system to another one, a lot of times you get some at least short-term temporary problems, negative things, because the transition just bring it sort of the old system as a system kind of worked in its own way. People were used to certain traditions and we're used to that. But when you change things and now everything's new and up and in the air, sometimes people will go a little crazy on whether they're citizens or government officials, and you tend to see in those kind of transitional societies sometimes some of this nastiness, some of the state repression. So that's maybe a little bit of an unexpected finding in the research that you should be familiar with that. So civil war is most likely. And this is one thing that's a little bit different. Now we're getting into war, and that's a little bit different than elite deviance. Elite deviance, the idea is that you have powerful people using their power and authority against weak people. And civil war is a little bit different than that. It's powerful group against powerful group, and maybe one group's more powerful than the other, but they're at least equal enough to actually have a real battle with each other. But anyway, civil war is most likely to emerge if the economy is poor, so you have a weak economy with lots of poverty, high population, you got overcrowding, more people than you can handle. Also, if this is just what the research says, that if you live in a society that's mountainous, a lot of people in the mountains, that sort of can be conducive to civil war because you get people up in the mountains who are sort of coalescing as one group, maybe the weaker group, against the stronger one maybe in the valleys. And so that sort of dynamic can be conducive to conflict as these groups are kind of separate from each other and may have conflicts with each other. Also, if there's a non-contiguous territory, what that fancy word non-contiguous means is if the territories are not connected to each other. So if the idea is if you have people who are living right next to each other and interact with each other a lot, then they're going to tend to have more positive relations or understand each other better and maybe have fewer conflicts than if they're more separated, if they're more physically separated from each other. They may kind of really grow their own very different cultures, and where they don't see that they have much in common, and that's more conducive to conflict, more conducive to fighting, to civil war. And also if you have a political life, and political life is fragile, meaning if you have just a really dysfunctional political system, your government and the way you do things just doesn't work, and the government just doesn't have its act together, poor leadership, you're going to get more conflicts that can spill over into massive, even to civil war. So that's just some of the factors that come out from the research in where you see conflict spilling out into actual civil war. A core finding here is that democratic institutions increase the cost of repression because authorities can be voted out of office. So if you are running a country and you're abusive of citizens' rights, well, citizens have the ability to vote, and if you get them really angry and upset and against you, well, they'll vote you out and vote somebody in who seems to be more sympathetic to their concerns and who helps them out, solves their problems better. So this is an argument in favor of countries being democratic, that when you give people a voice, that then you have a more peaceful society, and you have a government that doesn't feel the need to be so repressive and abuse its citizens, because problems can be solved peacefully and democratically. So that's an argument in favor of having a democratic kind of society, as opposed to one where people don't have the right to vote and the country's run by just a handful of people. Individuals in democracies generally accept specific values regarding peacefulness, toleration, communication, and debate. So part of it's a cultural thing, that if you've lived in a country like the United States that's been a democracy for a very long time, or has democratic institutions, where we don't need to get into is, it's what's the form of government the United States has, Republican, representative, democratic. But just speaking generally, where when we say democratic, we mean that the people have a voice in in their government, and a vote. In that kind of society, especially if you've had a democracy for a long time, like the United States, you tend to develop a strong culture that is against state repression, that's against violence, that is against coercion, that people tend to come to really value debate, discussion, political competition. That let's compete for people's votes, and the person with the best message, the person who seems to be the best candidate wins. And so it's all peaceful, and that we need to have free debate and communication and share ideas and let those ideas compete with each other and see which way the people want to go, and avoid all of this nastiness that, it's wrong to to abuse people like this, to harm people, to intimidate, to scare people, to incarcerate people, to kill people, to harm people, that kind of thing. So this point here is that culture is important, and that you tend to get positive cultural values in a democratic society. So it's just another way of saying that democracies tend to have less of this state repression. Democracies provide an alternative mechanism of control through participation and contestation, meaning if you can express yourself at the ballot box, then you don't have to express yourself violently, right? It's an alternative to violence. It's a peaceful way to handle people's disagreements about how things should be run. Repression becomes harder to defend if in a place where there's alternatives. The state doesn't have to be abusive and mistreated citizens, because we have a system, an alternative way of handling our problems and our disagreements, a democratic process, right? So repression becomes more illegitimate, like it's harder to defend it as being an acceptable way to handle things when there are alternatives, and alternatives that work. Okay, let's see. Let's stop it right there, and we'll see you in the next section.